Okay. Right, can you see that? Hopefully you can.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I just need to get the chat up. God damn it. It's not an auspicious start this morning. All right, pop out chat. Try again. Right, third time lucky. I can see the chat. So if anyone has any questions at any point, please just either shout out or pop them in the chat. And I'll pause and try and clarify what you don't understand or answer the question. So today, another fantastic, thrilling methods lecture that's designed to help you all individually prepare for your dissertations. So the topic of today's extravaganza is methodologies, methods, and then a separate section at the end on ethics, which, as you'll see, will link very closely to some of the discussion around methods and how you choose a methodological approach for your dissertation. I'm borrowing some slides from my colleague Albina Yaneva, who usually gives this lecture. She's away on an evaluation panel this semester, so she can't give the lecture herself. But as you'll see, the central part of it is based very strongly around Albina's lecture from last year. So thanks to her for passing those on. This morning's contents, a short section really just to outline what we mean by methodologies and methods. Again, trying to talk about this in very general terms and asking you to think through the general discussion from your own point of view as you begin to formulate or focus in on what your dissertation might involve. How do these general discussions apply to your interests, or are there things that I present or we talk about during the session that help you clarify the scope of your work for the dissertation? So try and make it personal, try and see it from the researcher's point of view and imagine yourself in that role. So after a fairly short introduction, I'll give Albina's lecture effectively, which is about the National Graphene Institute and an ethnographic methodological approach. So I'll talk to that in detail for various reasons that will become clear, hopefully. So that the first part will be longer than the second part, but after I've finished talking about the NGI, we'll have a break. And come back. I'll talk in less detail about a range of other methods that are popular amongst dissertation students and a number of other methodological approaches that you might think of or maybe you haven't thought of but will become relevant for your own interests. And then a short section right at the end on the principles of researching ethically and some of the practicalities that you'll need to know about. We'll come back to ethics in a bit more detail around Christmas when you have a clearer idea of how your own projects are shaping up. But it's important at this stage that you know it's there. So that's the plan. All right, introduction, methodologies and methods. Again, I sort of showed this last week. Certainly it relates back to the previous 3 lectures on preparation for dissertation. Leandro's talked about research design. Last week I was talking about literature reviewing, and this week talking about methods and methodologies. And these 3 things are interrelated. So, for all of you, whatever program you're studying, whatever interests you have, however specific your dissertation becomes, you'll all have to address this diagram, these interconnections for your own work. So again, what are you trying to find out? What are you asking? What are your research questions? What's your hypothesis? Last week we were talking about how that might lead you to search particular kinds of literature and help you understand or help you contextualize your specific questions in this broader context. But today I want to talk about methods, methods that you might choose to help you answer that question, but also methodologically how your research design fits back into the context. So these three things are interrelated, although we've presented them in a particular order from research design to literature review to methodology. You might enter your dissertation from any one of these 3 points. You might have very clear interest in a method or a methodology, and then you're sort of looking for a context and looking for a question to help sharpen that. It might be that you do something in research methods workshops that piques your interest. It could be using a particular method or developing a methodology, and again that provides you with the way into your dissertation. So these 3 things are interrelated. And yeah, I'll be focusing on methodologies and methods, but we'll be referencing the other 2 at various points. So methodologies and methods often discussed together, but they're not the same thing. And I think it's much easier to understand what methods are. They're a kind of tool that you can isolate and use. Methodologies are more complex and harder to grasp, for sure. So if you feel like you're struggling to define your methodology, you're probably not alone. As I was saying last week with some aspects of literature reviews, there'll be moments where you're kind of floundering through certain phases of dissertation. And you might feel that again when you're trying to clarify your own methodology. Talk to your tutor, but it's difficult, so expect some sort of difficulty. In principle, methodology is the sort of interpretive framework that you use to provide your dissertation or provide your research with some structure. So it's a way of thinking about, it's a way of studying stuff, phenomena, whatever it is that you're actually focusing on for your dissertation. So it can include aspects that relate to the philosophical basis for your study, or how you, either personally or as a researcher for the period of the dissertation, how you frame your understanding of the world or little bits of the world. You can think of it as the position that's taken by you as a researcher, and by your research, how you do it and how you write it up and present it. How you take a position in relationship to the broader context that I was talking about last week. Again, you can understand the context in which you're working without necessarily agreeing with it. So many of you might develop a methodology that explicitly sets up your work as a counter to existing studies of or ways of studying landscape, architecture, or urbanism. And I'll come back to that really close to the end. And the methodology also includes your research strategy, what kind of research you're doing, what you're doing, when you're doing it, in what kind of sequence, and what your motivations are for doing it. So it's a sort of justification for the way that you choose certain methods and the priority that you might give those methods. So I'll come back to that at various points. Methods are hopefully more straightforward. You can think of these as tools to gather what called data. Again, sounds pretty scientific. Data you can think of as information, the kind of information that you think you need to answer your dissertation question, to answer your research question. You might use the same method to collect data, to collect information and analyze it. You might use a particular method to collect information, and then a different method or a different tool to analyze it. Again, you can talk to your tutors in a bit more detail about your specific situation once you're in tutor groups and you're beginning to develop your own dissertation proposal. So basically, methods are tools to collect and help you analyze data, information. Again, really crudely, methods are usually split into quals and quants, or qualitative methods and quantitative methods. Again, just some examples on the screen at the moment. Again, popular examples that we find many students using during the dissertation. So for qualitative methods, usually talking about things that rely on a greater level of interpretation. Maybe working in archives, talking to people or observing people. Again, something that I'll talk about in much more detail in the middle section this morning. So doing interviews, doing observations, and also looking at documents and trying to read documents critically, using visual information, whether those are drawings or diagrams or photographs, films, and all of these kinds of source materials lend themselves to qualitative methods. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail on the way through. In contrast, again, generalizing, quantitative methods usually involve, well, I think of them as usually involving counting or numbers. So rather than interviewing one person or a small number of people, quantitative methods usually involve larger data sets. So doing larger surveys, doing statistical analysis, maybe using questionnaires. In some cases, it might involve doing building science type experiments and so on. So measuring data in a more scientific, quantitative way. But there are ways to combine these and to blur this fairly binary distinction. Again, sticking with crude binaries just for the moment, methodologically speaking, often hear distinctions made between kinds of objective or positivist approaches to methodologies. And if you think of this in terms of how you believe or how you might believe, you gain access to information about the world. An objective or a positivist approach would be characterized by a belief that there is an objective reality out there somewhere, and we can use particular methods to not gain access necessarily to the totality of that objective knowledge, but there's a belief that we can approach studies that approximate or move towards one kind of objective reality that lines up with some kind of universal knowledge of the world. Knowledge is real, it can be repeatable, there are similarities, the world can be explained, or the universe can be explained by patterns, scientific laws, and so on. Usually this is accompanied by very empirical approaches to using methods that measure, quantify, and then discern patterns or line up with pre-existing laws, and that provide explanations, working from patterns that are observed back into this overall objective reality. Again, really caricaturing what a positivist or an objective approach might be. In contrast, again, caricaturing this subjective or an interpretivist methodological framework. It's one that would be characterized by a belief in multiple realities. So an argument that the world is very complex and we can only know it partially. There are multiple coexisting realities that all can be in circulation simultaneously. Maybe an extreme view of that would be that every individual has their own view or understanding of the reality of their world that can't be mapped onto the realities of other people. So knowledge in this version is personal, it's interpretive, it includes very much an acknowledgement of your particular background, your characteristics. It's very situated, and it's based on the moment that you're in, or the kinds of frameworks and networks that you exist within. That acknowledges the importance of individual experience rather than kind of groupthink. And it will attempt to tease out how people give meaning to place, space, group, behaviour, and so on. So, from this little quote at the bottom from Alan Bryman, I'm arguing that social entities can and should be considered as constructions. So the world that we live in is built up of many different kind of socially agreed or disagreed versions of reality. Meanings are built up through the actions of people. And consequently, if you're trying to understand the world or trying to understand a little bit of it, you need to start with acknowledgement of these kinds of complexities. And just to finish this kind of brutal binary division, objective methodological frameworks are usually associated with physical sciences, and subjectivist methodological approaches usually associated with the arts and humanities and with the social sciences. Again, that's really crude. There are many much more interesting grey areas between these. Both these work. Both of these poles of this binary are fine for your dissertations. You just need to understand kind of where you want to situate your study and how that has an effect on the way that you proceed. Oops. Saying the same thing in slightly different ways, hopefully beginning to help you navigate how you set up your own study and how you begin to understand what your methodological approach might be and what your methods might be. You can think of these as at two different scales. So a strategic level decision about how you're developing your work, and then more tactical decisions you make about which methods or which methods you use. So again, thinking about these two different levels, strategy and tactics, or sort of longer term, and then more individual approaches you might use. Lots of students use case studies, a case study approach to help their dissertation develop. That could include a number of methods such as document analysis. You might use some focus groups, you might do some archival research, you might do a building visit or several building visits, you might be taking oral histories and so on. So these are all methods that could be clustered up and used as part of a case study approach. Similarly, you might want to do some kind of survey in that broad approach to doing surveys. That might include some kind of large-scale questionnaires. It might include large numbers of very quick interviews. It might include what we call digital ethnographies, all of which would fall under the umbrella of a sort of survey approach. Some students do what's called action research, where they're interested in a particular situation, maybe a particular practice, they're part of a particular group, and their research or their dissertation grows out of their involvement in that group. It might not be that they start with a particular question, they become embedded in that network and in that group of people, and by being part of the activities, they're very deliberately taking an involved route to using methods that helps them gather data. So again, it could be like making films of the stuff that's going on around them or the activities that they're taking part in. It could be keeping diaries about their involvement in this group activity. Could at a later stage involve some kind of focus group discussions with the people that they've been working with. Again, very recognised way of setting up a research project. And last one on the list, something that I'll talk about in much more detail in the second section, kind of ethnographic methodological framework that would involve a variety of different methods, including observations, interviews of various different flavours, keeping journals, and so on. So again, you try and think about your own dissertation at a variety of different scales. Overall, what are you trying to do at a smaller scale? Are there particular methods that help you gather up information and analyse that information in a way that fits your overall aims? And it's a way of sort of providing you with absolutely no reassurance. This is from a very influential sociologist, I guess, John Law, writing nearly 20 years ago now. You're trying to just reassure researchers that it's okay to work in messy situations, that not everything has an easy explanation. So he's talking about social sciences and talking particularly about what happens when social science tries to describe things that are complex and messy. So he's really advocating the importance of holding on to mess. I think it's quite easy to swap out social science here for landscape or for architecture or for urban design. They are also things that are complex, diffuse and messy. So I think for all of you, when we're talking about methodology and we're talking about methods, it won't necessarily be clear and simple. It won't necessarily be coherent. So sometimes that's the interesting thing about our disciplines, that they can lead to interesting interpretations of messy and complex situations. So be prepared. It can not necessarily, it can include mess. Mess is fine. It might be that you develop a dissertation that includes both quantitative and qualitative methods as part of the work that you do. Again, that's fine. There are many students that really successfully mix different kinds of strategies, provided that they line up with the overall research questions or the aims of the study. Not automatically better, but on the back of what I was just reading out from John Law, in messy, complex, dynamic situations, sometimes a multi-strategy methodology or method can be a good way of responding. So just to try and put a little bit of flesh on the bones, so to speak, this is a project I'm currently working on. I'm very interested in temporary architectures, in fairs and in travelling fairs in particular. So this is I'm using a mixed methods, partly developing quite large data sets, linking UK-wide parliamentary legislation with a database of several thousand entries that allows me to analyze that data using GIS systems. So you're trying to paint a picture at a sort of national level. But then, I don't know if you can see how well you can see the slide, but each of these little dots is a fair. And clearly each one has its own very specific kind of nature. So as well as doing quite large scale quantitative research with a big database, I'm also using archival materials to find information that's very specific, historically specific and locationally specific. So mixing these kinds of old newspaper accounts, archival drawings of fairs as they're emerging, with the sort of larger scale study. So again, just an example of how these two different scales can help to tell a joined up story. And then finally, in this section, yeah, it can be difficult, but you can't ignore it, I'm afraid. So again, paraphrasing a different scholar, in this case, Keith Jenkins, I say the choice or your choice is not whether your research should be theoretical or not that you understand it theoretically or not, but rather, the choice is between research that's aware of what it's doing and research that's not. So you will have a methodology, whether you know it or not. You will be using research methods, whether you know it or not. The challenge really is to give those a vocabulary, to understand the pros and cons and to understand how they play a part in your overall dissertation study. So it will take time, it will take a bit of development and discussion with your tutor to work through, but all of you will have a methodology and methods that line up with your dissertation questions and with the context. So there will be some work teasing this out and explaining it to other people, to your reader. Okay, end of section 1. Anybody got any questions? If you have, shout out or pop it in the chat. Hopefully some of those things will become clearer as I talk through some more detailed examples. Silence. Okay. Keep going. So this is, a lot of this next section comes from Albaina's slides from last year, which is an account of a project that she's recently finished, studying, and those of you who've been on campus might have seen this building. It's the National Graphene Institute, just around the corner from the School of Architecture, so on the boundary between the MMU and UOM campuses. So I'll come back to this slide at the start of the next section. There are many ways that you could study the National Graphene Institute as part of a research study or as part of a dissertation. So ethnography is not the only way, but Albaina is an ethnographer by training. So for her, this is part of a long trajectory of studying architectural practices and studying buildings from an ethnographic point of view. So the New Architecture of Science, Learning from Graphene, recently been published by World Scientific. I had the book launch actually at the NGI a couple of weeks ago. And really it's a study of the unique design of the NGI, but contextualizing this particular building in amongst a number of new or fairly recently constructed scientific buildings around the globe, and exploring new generation of scientific practice alongside the kinds of architectural environments that have been produced to accommodate them. So for Albaina, the argument, in fact, the conclusion from her study, again, you can try and think this through as like a big dissertation. So your conclusion might be something similar, but her argument, or her conclusion, was that scientific buildings are vital settings for the active shaping of new research habits and ways of thinking, which can ultimately lead to new discoveries and new scientific discoveries that can then be commercialized into socio-technical solutions. In this particular case of graphene, but within the scientific community, this goes off in a whole variety of different directions. So for Albaina, it was this study that was very explicitly looking both at the architecture and at the behaviors of the scientists who use these buildings. Again, I think a really useful slide or a useful pro forma for all of you to revisit as your own dissertations get up and running, will be to think about or to try and articulate what you're doing in terms of your overall dissertation aim, your more specific dissertation objectives and the way that the methods that you choose help you to do this. So in the context of Albaina's study, her aim was to explore how the architecture of a new generation of science buildings, those that have been constructed in the last 20 years or so, how these buildings affect the way scientists think, how they conduct experiments, how they interact as larger and smaller groups, how they collaborate. So that's her overall aim. And the NGI, the National Graphene Institute in Manchester, as an advanced nanoscience building, provided her with a case study through which to explore these larger aims. So for all of you, you should try and write an aim for your dissertation. What is it that you're trying to find out? Objectives are linked to your aim, but are usually much more explicit and deliverable. So for Albaina, 2 different objectives. Firstly, to analyse the distinctive design features of the building and relate those to the long process of briefing, brief development and construction or negotiations that took place between the clients and the architects. And then secondly, to trace the actions and behaviours of scientists, the building managers, lab technicians, administrators, service staff, as they use the different spaces in the buildings and to identify individual and collective patterns of use. So important in the way that the objectives are written, these are clearly more demarcated, and you should be confident that you can deliver the objectives. So the aim is a sort of larger scale claim. Objectives, for all of you, should focus on something that can be demarcated and can be set out very clearly. And then for Albaina, the methods that she would use include semi-structured interviews, which I'll talk about in more detail, with a variety of the building users. So it's not just the scientists, it's everyone that's associated with the building, people that use it daily and the people that use it infrequently. As well as doing interviews, she did a number of ethnographic walks, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail. And she just observed how different people were using different spaces in the building in everyday situations and in more formal situations like conferences or workshops. So these were her methods, and we'll talk to those in a bit more detail. So again, for all of you, try and come up with a version of this slide that begins to explain your own dissertation. This is something that you should be able to do maybe around Christmas, early in January, as you begin to get a feel for how the entirety of your structure and your study can move forward, but really useful to have this kind of concise overview. So really importantly for Albaina, although she's looking at scientific practice, it's not just scientists doing specific experiments with these really expensive bits of machinery. It's the whole kind of complex network of interactions that take place in the building and beyond the building. So it includes the sort of peripheral spaces, service spaces. It includes talking to lab technicians as well as to the scientists. It includes understanding how the complex servicing of this building plays a part in its architecture and the practices of the scientists that use it. Also looking at the more informal spaces in the building, sort of breakout areas, the cafe, and so on, and how, as a whole, these work to support the work of all the people that are based at the NGI. So you need to think a bit more detail about what ethnography is and how it supported Albaina's study, but equally how it might support some of the dissertations that you do. I'll just work through a bit of background through to some detailed methods that much ethnographic practice involves. So this is a really influential Ethnographer, anthropologist, sociologist, Clifford Geertz, kind of writing in the early 70s. Again, I think you can swap out scientists for architects in this quote. But he's really arguing that if you want to understand what science is, or if you want to understand what architecture is, don't ask an architect directly, or don't believe what architects tell you, or don't believe what landscape architects or urbanists tell you. Much more important is to look at what these practitioners do and begin with that, and then test out what you're observing of their doing against what the discipline as a whole would claim it's doing. So don't believe how a discipline describes or a profession describes itself. Really measure what they do first. So these are kinds of source material that an ethnographic study might go to, how it uses sources to open up studies. So at the start of the research design process, an ethnographer might be asking, what sources can I use to help me answer these questions, or to help me understand this complex situation in a bit more detail? How can I gain access to them? So very practical questions, again, things that you should go through with your dissertation tutors in your own context. If you've got a wide choice, how do you select the most useful? As you begin to gather data, how do you start making sense of the data that you're accumulating? So we'll go through some of these. There are some problems or some challenges involved with all methods, and these kind of ethnographic tools are no different. Usually ethnography is associated with a sort of durational practice. So historically, typically, ethnographers would spend a long time in the sort of culture that they're studying. So again, Albana's worked with a lot of architectural practices, most famously with OMA, with Rem Koolhaas, as a kind of embedded researcher. So would spend long periods of time in this case, in the design practice, observing how people behave, how they interact, what goes on, all the kinds of practices that take place within an architectural office. Same with the NGI. You'd understand a survey, an ethnographic survey would need to spend some considerable amount of time just watching people, talking to people, observing how a building's being used. Clearly, for a dissertation, that's challenging. And so you need to, if you're interested in an ethnographic study, or the kind of questions that you're hoping to explore lend themselves to ethnographic techniques, and then think about how you can use time really efficiently. How you can make the use of a small number of quite intense visits to get the rich information that you need to support this kind of study. In some ways, COVID has made this more difficult because gaining long periods of access to people or to these kinds of work environments has become more difficult. In some cases, it's actually made ethnographic studies easier. So we'll talk about some of those pros and cons in a bit more detail in a minute. These are the sorts of things that Albana included on her list of methods and that were wrapped up in her overall methodology. So did a number of semi-structured interviews lasting between about 30 minutes, longer ones up to 2 or 3 hours. And we'll talk about interviews in a bit more detail in a short while. She also had informal chats and conversations with people using the building. Again, very insightful ways of understanding how well a building is functioning, but also understanding who's doing what within a large organisation. Included participant observation, so just watching how different people used some of the spaces in the NGI. Again, important that included not only the scientists in the labs, but all the staff using the NGI in all of the spaces, or as many of the spaces as she could gain access to. Did some archival research to understand more about the backstory to the building, the negotiations that took place as part of the briefing process and the design process. Also went on study visits, site visits, or tours of the building. Someone's got their mic on. I've got a small brain and I can't multitask very well, so if you could mute, that would be appreciated. Thank you very much. Last thing, including photo documentation or sort of records that were taken during these site visits. So again, could be photographs, other images that were available, diagrams or sort of sketches of the interrelationships, some of the activities that were taking place, and so on. So kind of rich menu of different kinds of methods, all of which were combined into this ethnographic methodology. The aim or the venture in ethnography is often described as trying to produce a thick description, so a rich description of some of these kind of complicated, messy and dynamic processes, kind of capture the richness of human architecture interaction in this specific location. Ooh, come back. So again, you all have different choices in terms of how you're choosing, how you're setting up your studies. And for Arbena, you're thinking about, well, who's most useful to follow, sound like a stalker, who's useful to observe, to help me understand the complex story of this building, the NGI. Where are they? Are they actually based in the NGI? Do they visit infrequently? How do I follow them? How do I observe what they're doing? If it's important to follow them frequently, how often is enough? How long is enough for any observation? Is 10 minutes enough to get some really interesting and relevant information, or do I need to follow them for 3 hours? Again, there's no right answer, but these are the kinds of preparatory questions that you might be asking yourselves. Where do they need to go for me to understand this building better, how it's supporting scientific endeavour? If there are certain spaces that you're more interested in, certain spaces that are more important to understand, which ones are they? And what kind of activities will help me understand this building better? Is it just the scientists? Is it someone changing the gas canisters? Is it observing how the scientists kind of meet together if they're having a coffee or they're in a conference? What kind of activities will help me understand more about this particular situation? And then, this is a really important slide. What's the balance between starting these activities and beginning your own kind of analysis? So you have to start somewhere. Having a conversation or making some observations and beginning to take some photographs or do some drawings that explain how people are using particular spaces. But out of those early activities, you'll already be almost subconsciously analysing the interviews that you're hearing, or the observations, the activities that you're seeing, kind of interrelationships between people and spaces. So observing, talking to people and analysing, all happening together. This is not a linear process where you do all of your interviews, all of your building observations, and you go back to your desk and start analysis. Analysis will help you to ask further questions that might prompt other conversations. It might help you refine subsequent interviews that you do. And it involves a healthy bit of guesswork. You don't know the answer. No one knows the answer. No one really knows how activities and the interrelationship between the scientific activities and the NGI are taking place. Again, back to Clifford Geertz's reminder, don't ask scientists what they're doing. Watch what they're doing and see if that correlates with what they say they're doing. So if you're using an ethnographic approach, trying to understand how an architectural practice operates, or how a building or how a landscape operates, it's fine for you to start guessing at meanings. early on in your observation or your interview process. And then you start assessing whether that guesswork is actually borne out by other information. So you'd sort of triangulate your early guesses with other information that you can gather. You test these out, you might have to refine them. Some early guesses might turn out to be correct. Other early guesses might need subsequent refinement. Other early guesses might be completely wrong. It's fine for you to just ditch them. So again, we're talking about data at several different points this morning. Ethnographic data, what we call data, our own constructions of what other people think they're doing. And so you have to watch what they're doing, listen to what they're telling you, and evaluate it. You'll try and provide some kind of explanation of what you see happening. It might be different from what they think they're doing or what they tell you they're doing, and that's fine. Again, this is sort of an aside. Ethnography can take place digitally as well as face to face. So as well as watching a practice develop by sitting in an architect's office for a day or a week, or by going on building tours, you can also very successfully understand how practitioners are developing projects by connecting with them via Zoom, for example. Just the way that we're doing at the moment, asking them to share work, to explain what they're doing, and follow through a project over its duration from inception to, in this case, exhibition. Again, this can work very successfully. So don't think, although ethnographic practice historically was something that would be done face to face in the world, it's made a very successful transition into COVID world. In some ways, it allows you greater reach. Whereas pre-COVID, if a dissertation was being developed with some kind of ethnographic practice, there would be an expectation that you'd have to choose a study that was close to Manchester, or certainly in the UK, because it would rely on you going back a few times to visit. With Zoom ethnography, clearly you can reach around the globe, and if you find willing participants, this can be done very successfully. Again, just another example from Albaina's work, ongoing study of how architects are working in practice. In this case, how architects have adapted their working practices during COVID. So in a large number of Zoom interviews, not just face to face, but as you can see, in this case, an interview with other observations available in the background. So you can, Albaina's talking to this Italian architect, and we can also see what's happening in the office at the same time. And that again allows you to understand a bit more about the kinds of behaviours that take place in the office, any adaptations that are relevant. So just sort of zooming out again, why ethnography? Well, it allows you access to a world from the inside. It allows you to enter into a group or into a kind of cultural practice and not necessarily become part of that culture, but allows you very close access to how the participants in that practice, how they behave, what they do. For most of us, that would involve a study of how the spaces and how the materiality of those spaces has a relationship with what they do. Either it determines it, or it's been determined by the kinds of practices that are relevant. And then further down the process, further through the process, ethnography is not just relating to how you gather data, but it also has a very strong influence over the kind of write-up that these studies have. So a dissertation that's been pursued using ethnographic methodologies would have a very particular flavour. It's normal for ethnographic writing to write in many of the participants that have been part of your study, to actually include their voices along with your own interpretation. So it's not you just summarising everything that's been, everything that you've heard, everything that they've told you, and kind of laundering those disagreements, if there have been, out of your study. It's just giving space for the different interviews, the different interviewees to express their position in their own words, and then around that you construct a reading of what you've observed. Again, you need to be able to justify the kinds of conclusions that you've come to by picking up certain kinds of patterns. But it's, in some ways, it's a fiction. You use their observations of what people are doing, use their words to move from early guesses through to more robust analyses, but you can't know for sure that this is exactly what's happening. So it involves some kind of creative act, as I would argue most research does. So again, back to Clifford Geertz, if you're doing ethnography, it's like trying to read a manuscript. You don't really know the language in which it's written. Might be some information that's sort of faded from view. It might be full of ellipses or full of gaps. It might be incoherences that come with the territory. There might be changes that practitioners make after the fact. They might try and describe their involvement as being more heroic, or they might try and hide mistakes that they've made. So there might be things that they tell you that are lies or exaggerations. And that's part of the enjoyment of doing ethnography, trying to understand the complexities of how people are behaving. Again, you don't have to grasp, you don't have to aim for a big picture. Quite often ethnographies focus on very small details, details of things you've been told, details of things that you've been shown, how people interact with each other in particular spaces. But out of those detailed interactions, large links can be made to much larger practices. So again, if you think back to that important slide with Albana's aims, objectives, and methods, focusing very much on small details will allow it to move back to the overall aims, which is to understand, sort of almost a global scale, how new science is being developed in tandem with new architectural environments. So small facts can speak to very large issues. By focusing your study in these kind of ethnographic ways, you can link it back to bigger debates, link it back to literature reviews that you've done already, and then make connections between your very focused studies and some of the bigger moves that are at play as part of the research context that you're operating within. And again, just to say the same sort of thing in a slightly different way, the locus of your study, so where it actually takes place, in this case, the NGI as a building, and also as a community of practitioners, scientists, and all the other building users. And that's the locus, that's the place where much of Albana's study took place. But the object of her study, the objectives, the overarching aim was different. She was trying to understand the relevance of the NGI in a broader, changing context of science, of new science. So you can use case study to answer your overall object, and that provides you with very detailed focus. Again, I'm going to move to analysis. As you've gathered up material using these various different methods, begin to, on a guess, develop your guesses into more rigorous explanations of what you're seeing in front of you. And then out of that, out of these descriptive interpretations of what you see, you can begin to offer theoretical explanations or formulations that help you capture what's going on. So the role of theory in this situation is to provide a kind of vocabulary through which you can explain or express what it is that you've been observing. And it allows you to draw larger conclusions from the grain of sand, from the detailed studies that you've been doing. Again, back to Clifford Geertz, the idea of these ethnographic thick descriptions and really rich accounts of detailed interactions between people, equipment, and space, and so on. These thick descriptions allow you to reach some kind of diagnosis of what's going on, and that's the work of theorization in these ethnographies. Okay, that's the overview. I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about interview practice in particular, because it's a very popular method among dissertation students. But for now, anybody got any questions about anything that I've been talking about, or about ethnography in particular? Stick it in the chat or shout out. I'll have a coffee while I'm thinking. All quiet, so I'm just going to soldier on. Right, so a bit more detail about interviews and preparing for interviews. Not necessarily within an ethnographic methodology. Interviews can be useful for a wide variety of different kinds of dissertation approach. So, a very popular technique amongst students. So, looking at them in a bit more detail. Again, sticking with Arbena's slides for now. These are, to start with, what's the difference between having a chat with architects, to understand broadly what it is that they're doing, and the kinds of interviews that you might set up to help you specifically with your dissertations. So an interview isn't a chat. Chatting can help you understand someone's role, someone's background, what they're doing as part of a practice. So in this case, architects with OMA, the NGI, it could be chatting to lab technicians or building managers or scientists to understand broadly what their role is within the organisation. But interviews are more focused. They're trying to extract or to get hold of data that will help you answer your research questions. So we'll go through these in a bit more detail. What's a research interview? How is it different from a chat? What do we understand by interview data? Why do we do interviews? Why are they useful? We'll look at very quickly at some different formats that you might use for doing interviews, particularly structuring semi-structured interviews, where you conduct interviews, how that might have an impact on what you can find out. So just as a question coming into the chat from Marwa, would these methods and methodologies come during or after the research process? You don't necessarily decide at the start. You don't necessarily decide at the start. If you think back to one of the slides that I showed at the beginning of today's presentation, in the one with the triangle, what I was trying to suggest is that for all of you, your dissertation will have some kind of question or hypothesis, have some kind of context, usually that you gain through literature reviewing, and you'll have some kind of methodology or methods. And it's fine for you to start your dissertation at any one of those points, maybe at a couple of points, and then work out the others. And so for some of you, it might be that you want to continue using a method or a methodology that you've already been trying out in research methods workshops. So maybe you generate your whole dissertation structure based on an interest in a method or a methodology. So for you, if that describes how you do it, method or the methodology might come first, and then you search for an object, or you search for a question or a case study that allows you to apply it, and you find the relevant literature that allows you to understand the context. So for some methods might drive you. Others, you might be asking a very specific question, and then you might work into that question by exploring literature that helps you understand the complexities of that question. And then the last thing you decide might be the methods and the methodologies that you use. And so, in that case, it might be you feel that you're already gathering momentum with your dissertation question, and it's only later that the methods that are appropriate and the methodologies that kind of harness those methods come into focus. So that's sort of saying the same thing in a very long-winded way, but it doesn't matter when you decide what your methods are, what your methodology is. It could be the first thing, it could come into focus after you've made other decisions. Most important is that when you get going, I'd say around Christmas or early in the new year, you need to go back to that diagram with the triangle, and you need to satisfy yourself and your tutor that all three of those aspects are becoming clear to you. Or you go to the slide with the aim, objectives, and the method, and you write that for your own dissertation. And by early in the new year, you need to have at least a draft version of that, so you can see how these different activities interrelate and cohere. Clear as mud? Great. Okay, so back to interviews in a bit more detail. Interview, in contrast to a chat or a conversation, implies some kind of guided interaction. You approach individuals because you think they have some information that can help you develop your dissertation. So it's a selected interaction because someone has some knowledge that you can use, and you're guiding that kind of interaction because you have some questions that you want answered. Usually interviews take place with some kind of framework or some kind of script, a list of questions, and we'll have a look at different versions of using interview questions in a few minutes. Your questionnaire or your kind of guide questions could be written. So it could be a written exchange. You might have a written set of questions that you refer to support or provide a sort of structure to a conversation, to a verbal interaction. You might have some questions that you don't feel you can ask explicitly because it would guide your interviewee to give you a pre-prepared answer. Again, think back to the Clifford Geertz quote: don't believe what scientists tell you about what they're doing. Don't believe what architects tell you about what they're doing. Look at what they're doing and make your own minds up. So, sometimes if you ask a question that's too direct, you'll get the kind of party line, or you'll get the scientific version or the architectural, the landscape version of what they think they should be telling you. So again, preparing your interview questions takes some time, and depending on what you're trying to find out, you can take advice from your tutor once you are in your tutor group. Again, it's good practice, and I'll come back to this right at the end of today's session, to explain who you are and why you think they can help you. So you can explain that you're a dissertation student at the MSA, and you can explain a little bit about your dissertation topic and where you think they fit into it. So you're asking them some things, maybe some personal things about what they're doing. So it's good practice to kind of even out that dynamic at the early stage of an interview, or even at the first point of contact. So explain why you want to talk to them, how you're interested in their world, and what you think they can provide you with in terms of information. Some people might take some persuading. So again, how you make that initial contact is very important sometimes. And also the data that you get from an interview is unique. It's primary data. It's information that few, if anybody else, has. So it gives you a unique insight into the operation of a building or an organization, or as a space. So it's valuable. It's valuable for your dissertation, and it allows you to talk with some authority about the topic that you're researching. So different formats of interview. Think about where they might take place. There's some interviews, especially if you're interviewing professionals, either landscape architects, urbanists, planners, maybe clients, building control officers, planners, and people who have a sort of professional interest in or involvement in a kind of construction industry or design process. It's very common for you to interview them in their own office, in their natural surroundings. So this kind of seated interview, frequently take place either at their desk or maybe a conference room that they have in their offices. Again, it's useful because they have the material that they work with on hand. If you try, in this case, this guy's explaining some sort of workflow diagram or kind of Gantt chart that helps understand the sort of interrelationships and the dependencies between different phases of a project. And so this might have come up as part of a question. How can you tell me how these things happened? Like, yeah, okay, I can find this document. Here it is, or here's an early version, and maybe showing you different kinds of iterations of the workflow or of work package planning. And so a seated interview perhaps is a bit more formal, but it does allow more detailed conversations around particular documents. If they don't have the documents prepared before the interview, if it's in the office, they can go and get them and bring them back and help to expand on a particular point that you were talking about in the interview. And so quite formal, but very common way of conducting an interview. And it allows you to sit there with your list of questions and to work through them quite methodically, because there are less distractions in this kind of environment. In some situations, it's more useful, or it's only possible to do what's called a walking interview. Again, pros and cons to a walking interview. Clearly, someone doesn't have documentation on hand to help explain a particular question that you might have asked, to respond to a question you've asked in more detail. And what it does allow them to do is to talk about their relationship to a building, how they use a particular space. It also helps you to understand how they understand the building, if that's an important part of what you're exploring. So it helps you to get to know them, helps you to put interview questions very much into their world, and helps them to draw attention to things in the environment that are important to their practices, whether they're a scientist in the NGI or a building manager or a building technician, helps them take you to the places that are important for them, either because they enjoy them within the building or within the landscape, or they're particularly important because of how the building or how that particular landscape is meant to be supporting them in their work. And so it's a slightly different relationship. You're kind of doing things on the hoof. It's harder for you to take notes, and maybe you can record it. It's harder for you to refer to a list of questions and to go through those methodically in the order that you hope to ask them, because you're kind of moving around and you're responding to things that They're showing you, maybe you bump into other people, and your interviewee introduces you to them, so the conversation goes sideways. And again, really useful information can come from walking interviews. Also helps you to gain an insight into the kind of spatial material environment that you're studying. And another approach to interviews, sort of where interviews fold into observations. If you're looking at a practice, they are happy for you to observe what's happening. I mean, clearly, if it's not a formal situation, if they're not making a client interview, or they're not concentrating on a bit of work, but maybe they're just in a team meeting, talking through decisions that they want to make. Very often they'd be happy for you to ask them questions in this situation, just to, what are you doing? Why is that important? Or what are you trying to achieve from doing this? So an informal interview kind of breaks out from an observation to allow you to understand a bit more about what you think you're seeing in front of you, and maybe gives participants chance to clarify exactly what it is that they're doing. If you don't understand what this meeting's about, what these activities are involving. Again, if interviews potentially form part of dissertations that you're writing, sort of choices that you have to run through, or kind of conversations that you might have with your tutor before you get going. Who do you need to interview? It might be that it's just one person would be enough because of the way that your dissertation is set up. But one key interview might provide you with a whole range of fascinating data that would fold into and complement other information that you've got from other sources. It might be that you're trying to interview 5 people or 20 people. There are practical considerations in terms of how long these take to set up, how long they take you to write up and process. But there's no right answer. Think about what you're trying to find out. Think about who has information that would be useful. Think about who's willing to talk to you, and then you can go through this list. So from who do you interview? Maybe before that, who might you interview? You might have a long list, and you might approach some people on that list. If they agree, then you say, well, I can talk to that person, so I don't need to talk to that person if I don't have time, or if they're not willing. Where and how sort of refers back to the 3 broad modes of interviewing that I've just gone through. Is it an interview at their offices? Do you meet them in a cafe? Do you meet them on site? Do you meet them in Zoom or in the virtual world? Do you raise questions as part of an observation? So where and how often? It might be that for some of your interviewees, one well-structured interview is plenty. Gives you all the information that you need. Thank you very much. I'll go away and think about this. Other dissertations might rely more on a durational approach, where you're sort of revisiting either the same people over a number of months. And it might be that you're studying a particular space. It can be a landscape, it can be an urban space, it can be a building, and you're interested in how its use changes over time. So it might be that you need to plan some kind of interviews that were with the same people or in the same places, because you expect that will give you different kinds of data. How long? Some really useful interviews can just be 15 minutes. They're well structured, very focused. Thank you very much. Away you go. Some interviews might be 2 or 3 hours. So there's not a right answer, but I'll come on to interview fatigue, which you may be feeling right now. And again, where is appropriate for you to talk to these people? Or maybe where's inappropriate for you to talk to these people? I'll come to that when we're talking about ethics right at the end. So again, walking you through preparing for interviews. This might not be useful for all of you, so if not, just sort of zone out for a minute. But if you think interviews will be a useful kind of activity, here's a useful checklist that just walks you through the process. So prepare, literature review, question, read up on who they are and why you think talking to them will be useful. That might be that they have an involvement in a particular organisation, they've been involved with a particular project, or that they're habitual users of particular spaces. Again, with your tutor, take some advice. How do you prepare good questions? Or how do you avoid bad questions? Usually good questions can be, if you're preparing for an interview, open, rather than a question that's closed in the sense that it just leads to a yes or no answer. If all your questions are yes or no, then that will lead to a very short interview, which probably doesn't get you the most from meeting that person. And so if you are using interviews, rehearse them with your tutor, try them out with your mates, see how well your questions are working. And so pilot them before you go to the real interview and see how you can refine them. How much is enough? Maybe 4 or 5 is plenty to structure a really useful exchange. It might be good to prepare a number of key questions that you really want to ask, and then a number of supplementary questions that you can ask. If the conversation goes this way, I would like to know about A, B, and C. If it goes this way, I can ask about X, Y, and Z. So be prepared to be a bit flexible with interviews. They're not always predictable. So don't be thrown if the conversation goes in a direction you just didn't anticipate. Try and have a number of reserve questions that you can fall back on in particular situations. And again, part of preparation involves thinking about the right way of contacting people. For some of you, we might have 1 or 2 key participants that you really like to talk to. If that first moment of contact really pisses them off, then you've probably blown it for that person. So just need to be careful about how you approach someone in the first instance. It might be if it's someone that you've met or that you can meet in the real world, partly if they're part of a group or part of a practice that you're already familiar with, then you might be able to just have a conversation with them. In real life, if you know them well enough, you might be able to phone them up. If they're part of a practice or part of an organisation, then perhaps it's better to approach the organisation in general. If they have a kind of outward-facing public point of contact, again, explain who you are. A student on X programme at MSA, writing a dissertation about this topic, and you'd really like to talk to this person or someone in the organisation about these particular issues. So explain who you are and why you're approaching them. Sometimes you might approach what's called a gatekeeper. That's someone in an organisation who can direct you to the right person. So it might be that they're your first point of contact. Might be that they're a point of contact as part of a network in a project. If you can identify who they are, and it might not be the case that you need to interview them, but if they have a good overview and understanding of the project, they could say, okay, I can understand what you're trying to do, and you need to speak to these 5 people. And if they're a kindly soul, they might help to put you in contact with those 5 people, for example. So key stakeholders, if you like, key people in the sort of area that you're working in, and will help you to gain access. Or conversely, if you upset the gatekeeper to a particular situation, they might then prevent you from, or they might discourage other people from becoming part of your dissertation project. So again, if you have any doubts about who to contact or how to make that first contact. Talk to your tutor and they can give you some advice about how to do that given the specifics of your particular project. Again, don't last point, don't interview random people. If you can't explain why you want to talk to them, then I'd go away and do a bit more thinking and refine your questions, or don't bother. It's not for everybody. Again, just a bit more detail. You're preparing your questions, they should be linked back to your overall research questions, your dissertation research questions or your research hypothesis. If you're asking people questions that you can't connect back, then they're possibly the wrong questions. Or if through preparing for interview, you get some fantastic questions and you need to clarify the connection to your overall research question, and then that might help you to shift the frame for your whole dissertation slightly. So, just saying a few minutes ago, preparing methods can actually help the whole of your dissertation to gather momentum. It can be small in number. 3, 4, 5 questions can be sufficient to get really rich information back from an interview process. So don't go in with a list of 20. That'll take you hours to get through. Again, top tips: avoid any sort of jargon. Try and ask your question or your questions as simply as possible. If you think back to the quote from Clifford Geertz, don't believe what scientists tell you about science, watch what they do. Or to paraphrase that, don't believe what architects tell you, look at what they do. If you ask questions using very technical vocabulary, it almost anticipates the scientist, the architect, other professionals replying using that kind of technical vocabulary. So I think it's a really good practice for you to ask a question as simply as possible. Don't try and be clever. Don't anticipate the kinds of answers they'll give. Try and ask your question from first principles and then listen to the answers that you're given. And it's in that close listening that you'll find information that doesn't necessarily conform to the broad scientific or the broad architectural or landscape architectural party line. So almost deliberately naive questions can set up very rich responses, can get people talking about what they do, and then by listening carefully you can understand much more about their particular practice and whether that fits into other people's other understandings of that kind of practice. Yeah, during the interviews, have some sort of during the interviews, take notes if possible. Clear this with your interviewees before you start. It's usual to record interviews, but not everyone is happy for this to take place. Sometimes people are happy with an audio recording, but not video. So just set the ground rules, probably when you're getting in touch with people. If you can, take notes. If you're walking, it might be difficult. If you do a walking interview and you haven't been able to take notes, as soon as you say goodbye, find somewhere quiet and just do a brain dump and try and record everything that's just happened as accurately as possible. Okay, think things that might make you nervous beforehand. Are you asking the right questions? Are you asking the questions in the right way to get a positive response from your interviewees? When they start talking, how do you know they're telling the truth? What are they hiding? If I've only got 15 minutes for this important, busy person, will I get what I need from that session? So these kinds of things will make you nervous beforehand, and there's no way to tie these all off before you start, but good preparation will make the interview as productive as possible. It won't stop these questions nagging at you, but good preparation will help you to stop worrying or reduce your worry before you begin the interview. Are they telling you the truth, and what are they hiding? That's really a conversation that you come back to after the interview is finished, and you begin to analyze the kind of information that they've given you, how that fits with your broader understanding as that's developing from different sources. Again, same sort of thing in a slightly different way. Can you, if you prepared a set of questions, how strictly do you think you should stick to it? Might be some things that you desperately want to ask because you think they're crucial to your dissertation. Other things you can be more flexible with. I think you just have to try and read the situation. Where there are some things that you really want to ask, just try and force those questions into the conversation. If you are talking to someone, the conversation feels really rich and engaging, but it's going in a completely unexpected direction. If you feel comfortable with that, then allow it to develop. Quite often you might need to encourage your interviewee or get them back on track. So some kind of minor questions or clarifications are useful, just to give them some feedback, let them know that they're still talking in a way that's useful for you. So encourage them. Some people might need encouragement, or might need encouragement to explain things that to them seem really ordinary, but to you as a researcher need some kind of insight. Some people talk a lot, so it might be that the challenge is to get them to stay focused or get them to shut up. Use your judgment. And listen carefully. Try and process what they're telling you. If something surprising comes up in interview, then probe it further. Something surprises you, then ask them to elaborate on it or to clarify it and chase that. I said a couple of the slides ago, if you're doing interviews in situ, either in someone's office or a walking interview around the space, that can allow you to gather up a wider range of information. So it's not just the verbal exchange, but it's more, allows you to make more observations about how they're behaving, where certain information is available, how they might interact with other people in their team, or how they might interact with the building. So it can allow you to gather more information than simply what's being presented to you. Yeah, how tricky questions might be. It can lead you to. Sorry, there's something coming in the chat. I'll pick up the questions in a minute. A tricky question. If you ask the wrong question, they might set off on a lengthy account that doesn't really help your dissertation. You've got to sort of either interrupt them politely and try and get back on track, or try and ask a question again in a slightly different way, or you just have to sit it out and listen to this sort of long answer that probably isn't going to help you. I said a few minutes ago, if you try and be smart, if you ask quite a technical question, or you ask questions that use technical vocabulary, it might prompt your interviewee to give you quite a specific answer. So again, very open, almost naive questions can be a way of avoiding this. Again, if you're interviewing people that you've never met before, you might have to make some quite quick judgments, whether when you meet them for the first time to start the interview, or you can discern something of their character as part of setting up the interview. But people can be quite hard to read, so you need to be mindful that they've got information that's useful. If you upset them or you scandalize them, they'll just stop, or they'll clam up, and they won't give you information that you think you need. So just go carefully to start with. Some people are very comfortable talking to students. Some people are very comfortable talking about what they do. but not everybody is. So don't make assumptions about the character of the people that you're working with, who've agreed to share their expertise with you. Again, you find this is slightly different if you interview other architects or other designers and other professionals within the construction industry. There's a kind of a set of assumptions or a shared world that makes that initial connection more comfortable. If your dissertation research takes you to other people that aren't used to talking to architects or designers, and then again, I think just go steady, and if you can, just build up a bit of rapport in the early stages of the interview, and then when you get a feel for how comfortable your interviewees are, then if you've got harder questions, more probing questions, then you have a feel for how you can ask those. But if it goes well, interviews are fantastic. It can open up your understanding of completely new worlds. Well, there's a question from David in the chat. Thanks, David. Yeah, people often talk at length from the starter question, and it's something that we might call a semi-structured interview, where you have a number of prompts, and as long as you set them off in the right direction, then you've given them a bit of guidance, and you can let it run. Or in a version of that, you might have a number of questions sort of in your back pocket. If the starting question doesn't always, or if it kind of runs out of steam, and then you can drop another one in. But David, there you are. Do you want to elaborate on that? Rather than me doing it?
I think, Stephen, I think your discussion of interviews is fantastic. But you're sort of, we're inviting people to go in. Everyone should fear to tread. You've described it very carefully. I just know that we were looking at Jim Dyson, and the architect and I were looking at Stoke-on-Trent, and we asked somebody who was running an ice cream parlor, why was his ice cream parlor there? One question, and the answer came back as an hour. We were not conspicuously recording this, but it was amazing. It went into his father and land relationships. So I would invite the students listening, and I'm obviously not an elected presenter here, but I would invite the students to sort of think about almost like a one-question friendship introduction, and some people will then tell you a great deal and would like to be friends. I think the script can be off-putting because other agencies use scripts to collect data, and so you've got scheduled questions, and it looks like you're working for an agency, and then you're going to try and sell something. That there's a sort of sucker punch at the end of a series of questions, whereas the invitation for them to do all the work can be very successful. It's just a street view I'm giving here, because
I think it's really useful. Actually, it reminds me of actually a studio project, not in a dissertation, but some of my students worked with. It's kind of sort of conceit that you sometimes get at weddings, but they had a picture frame, quite a big picture frame, and we were working in Selby, and they were just trying to get passers-by just in the street to talk a bit more about Selby and their environment, and they did it with a picture frame. So it's like your conversation with the ice cream man.
Fantastic.
And a prompt, they just had picture frame. So can you show us something about Selby that you really like? And that was it. And these people in the street were just using it to sort of frame a view. And as you say, it's out of that very simple starter, it's a kind of icebreaker, and especially for people that aren't used to talking to architects, many things will follow. So you probably get kind of overcome with information.
I would see our roles as get confused with other sales personnel in the streets, you know, who try and collar you, and people are very conscious of scams. But anyway, I'll leave it there, because there was one other thing. We wandered into a factory, and we wanted to know how this factory functioned inside Burslem, Stoke-on-Trent, and they brought down the manager, and the manager decided he would like to tell it all. You know, it was it's just like Christmas. It's a gift, you know. But and it was, you think, well, actually, had we had the scheduled questions, we might have blocked his progress, you know, and that can happen, can't it? Anyway, I'll mute now. Thanks for that. Cheers.
Okay, brilliant. No, that's really useful. Thanks, David.
Thanks.
Okay, I think we're nearly there. We'll have a short break in a minute. So this is just back to Albana's NGI project. This is her questionnaire. This is sort of the guide that she used to structure her semi-structured interviews. So you're moving from a kind of icebreaker question, you know, like David just mentioned at the ice cream van, you know, something that just puts people at their ease. You know, you tell me about your role, what you do here, how long you've worked here, that sort of thing. Moving through to some more specific questions that she knew she wanted to explore in a bit more detail, but was prepared to, you know, again, if you get the hour-long answer, it might be that you never get past question one, and you just use your judgment. Yeah, again, something that we're all too familiar with at the moment. Questions, and this is Albana's research methods workshop from last year, where groups of students were interviewing practitioners. And so again, a lot of the principles I've just been talking about in terms of preparing for interviews work pretty much as well in a Zoom world, has a benefit of, you know, being able to record it and transcribe it automatically. Fantastic. Yeah, so, you know, same kinds of suggestions in terms of preparation. You know, touched on these already, really. Depending on who you're talking to, you know, as David's just mentioned, some people might be suspicious of you. Some people might be used to having more professional exchanges. And so try and think about who you're talking to, and develop your preparation accordingly. Again, you know, tips and tricks. Some people like to talk for hours. Some people are really reluctant to talk. So, you know, what if you get a talkative person? What if you get a quiet person? How might you handle those two very different situations? Again, what if they're suspicious or unwilling to talk to you, or they've been kind of cajoled into talking to you? How can you put them at ease and make that a useful conversation? Many people might be interested in talking to you if they're in architecture or in urbanism or in landscape, and they might be sympathetic but busy, so they might give you 15 minutes. How do you make the most of that short window? Yeah, and so on. Right, I'm boring myself now. I think I'm just going to press on and get to a break before we all fall over. Again, last thing really before we have a break, interview data. It's kind of all of the stuff that we've been talking about. So the preparation of the questions, the answers that you get, and how you begin to guess what it means, and how you test and refine what it means. How you then put that back into an understanding of who you were talking to, how they form part of an organisation, how they use a space or a set of spaces, how all of that connects to your overall research project. All of this is the interview data and helps you analyse it. And again, you can move through different kinds of so after you've had an interview, these are different screenshots, but on the left-hand side, just a little snapshot of a transcript. So sometimes it's important to just transcribe an audio recording. And so you have the questions that you asked and the responses that your interviewee provided. It takes a lot of time. If you're using Zoom, you can get a first pass, and automated transcript. If you've got an audio file, there are some pretty good programs now that will do a kind of automatic transcription from those audio files. Then you can kind of interpret that, so almost like a diary or a write-up of your visit, either through your own eyes or through, in this case, Alexandra, who took Albania around, and supplementing that with, in this case, some visual images that were taken during the interview or during the tour. And these kinds of things can work together to provide a sort of rich, thick description of the place. Okay, I'll just leave these on the slides, but you can pick those up if you need to at a later date. Last thing, always say thank you. You know, it takes a lot of effort for you to set up an interview. It takes a certain amount of commitment from your interviewees to take part, perhaps take part more than once. So it's just polite and it's good practice to thank them. Again, just from Albana's slides last year, one of the dissertation students from 2 years ago did an ethnographic study of Rudy's, the pizzeria. So he spent quite a lot of time during his dissertation studying the space, studying the practices of the front of house staff, customers, chefs, everyone involved in the process. At the very end, he went and took a copy of his dissertation back to Rudy's, and again, just it's a chance for him to thank them for letting him take part in the restaurant effectively. And they were so pleased to see what he'd produced, that they gave him some free pizza. Fantastic. So there's a lesson in there for all of us, I think. Okay, just before we break, anybody got any questions about either ethnographic methodologies in general or interviews in particular? I suggest we have a break. Okay, so it is now, what time is it? (12:47). 11:47. Why don't we come back at 12? The second part is much shorter. You'd be pleased to know. 12 o'clock, have a screen break, and I'll see you shortly. Hello again. I can't see if anyone's here, so I'm just assuming that you're all back. Right, I'm going to keep going because we've got busy lives. In contrast to the last section, which was very detailed, what I want to do in the next, I don't know, 40 minutes or so is to zoom out and to talk more quickly about a wider range of methodologies that are sort of popular with student dissertations. Have a look at another sort of method that's popular and appropriate for dissertations, and then have a quick run through ethics. That's the plan. Let's see how we get on. So back to the NGI, we talked about Albana's study in detail. Clearly, it's not the only way that that building could be the subject of or the locus for a dissertation. And so, there are many different ways to approach similar kind of subjects or similar kinds of examples. So, we talked about an ethnographic methodological approach and the sorts of methods that were appropriate for that framework. You could equally talk about the NGI with a sort of phenomenological methodology. That's something with an interest in human body and its sort of performativity and the interaction between bodies and space. There's again a big body of academic literature on phenomenology and architecture. So it could be that if that's your interest, you can just sort of change the frame and have a really interesting study of effectively the same building. A long history of the histories of landscape, architecture, and urbanism being written from the point of view of typologies. So it would be an interesting study of the NGI to position it as a typological study, as a building type, and explore how well that fits into either other typologies of campus building or other sort of historical trajectories of buildings constructed for science and how they change over time. So something with a more historical sort of flavour. Or you could look at the NGI from the point of view of its building performance. That could be in terms of its kind of environmental performance, or it could be in terms of structure or construction, its environmental material performance, and so on. So many different ways in which the same building could provide you with a starting point that you then take into dissertations that go in very different directions. So that's just really, I guess, to state the obvious. Right, I want to try something now that might go badly wrong, but always up for trying things out. I'm very conscious that in these lectures, I do a lot of the talking, which is never a good thing. So what I want to show you is a very short clip of a film that was part of an exhibition that's just closed on Sunday at the Whitworth Gallery. Some of you might have seen it. It's an exhibition by Forensic Architecture called Cloud Studies. And this section is a summary of one of the research projects that they were presenting as part of that exhibition. So I'm going to play it, and then I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of thinking about this research project and to think about it, or to offer your view of what its aims were, what its objectives were, and what its methods were. So if this was a dissertation, how is it being set up? Well, I'm hoping the sound works. If it doesn't, we're stuffed, but I'll give it a go.
State of Louisiana, a region once known as Plantation Country, has become the Petrochemical Corridor. Here, over 200 petrochemical plants occupy fallow sugarcane plantations, producing some of the most toxic air and highest rates of cancer in the nation. The shadow of these toxic clouds is cast over the descendants of the people enslaved, born and buried on these clouds. And as the plants pollute the air they breathe, it crushes the remains of their ancestors. The petrochemical industry has inherited the spatial logics of settler colonialism and slavery. It is the latest phase of a continuum of environmental racism spanning 300 years. Here on Juneteenth 2020, residents of St. James visited the Buena Vista Plantation Cemetery, an ancestral burial ground on land occupied by Petrochemical Corporation Formosa Plastics, in order to reclaim their right to life, land, and breath.
No more racism. No more racism. No more racism. Over me.
You hear that okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you. Sorry, I've got no idea what was beamed out from here. Right, I might play it again in a minute. What I'd like to do in the chat, I know this is from the hip with very little preparation, but can you try and explain or offer what you think the aim of that research project was? Maybe explain some or offer some objectives and try and describe some of the methods that they used. Do you want to see it again? So if you can put these in the chat, we'll just, well, we can either chat about it or it helps me understand whether it made any sense at all. Right, so in the chat, put aim, objectives, methods, not necessarily all of them, but any that you can offer. Right, I'll play it again while you're thinking.
State of Louisiana, a region once known as Plantation Country, has become the Petrochemical Corridor. Here, over 200 petrochemical plants occupy fallow sugarcane plantations, producing some of the most toxic air and highest rates of cancer in the nation. The shadow of these toxic clouds is cast over the descendants of the people enslaved, born and buried on these clouds. And as the plants pollute the air they breathe, it crushes the remains of their ancestors. The petrochemical industry has inherited the spatial logics of settler colonialism and slavery. It is the latest phase of a continuum of environmental racism spanning 300 years. Here on Juneteenth 2020, residents of St. James visited the Buena Vista Plantation Cemetery, an ancestral burial ground on land occupied by Petrochemical Corporation Formosa Plastics, in order to reclaim their right to life, land, and breath.
No more racism. No more racism. No more racism. Over me.
Okay, any offers? What do you think their aim was, or objectives, or their methods? This could have been a dissertation. In fact, one of the prize-winning dissertations in MSA last year was on Cancer Alley, so exactly this topic. Any offers? Thank you. Right, let's have a look. Okay, so from Danish, aim exploring evidences of racism in the operation of petrochemical plants in Death Alley, Louisiana. Okay, fantastic. So, the aim, very broadly described. David, yeah, so kind of methods and methodological approaches, performance art, political activism, any other methods that you can detect from that very short clip? Yeah, so Mara aims exploring relationship between race, geography, and the consequences of chat's moving. Consequences of historically colonial extractive industries. Yeah, absolutely. And looking at this length of the Mississippi and Louisiana as a sort of case study. So, yeah, case study, methodology, yeah, methods. So in addition to the methods that David mentioned, archival sources. So you saw just in the little inserts, various different land maps from different points over almost a 300-year history as the use of this stretch of land had changed over time. So there's a sort of bit of archival work in there, tracing and comparing how different tracts of land and land ownership had passed, but within that change, what kind of constant lineages existed and what kind of continuities were there. So I lost my cursor. Aims. Yeah, outlining human-made environmental pollutants that cloud over local residents. So, as well as a sort of historical aim, the film started by looking at contemporary evidence of pollutants that are currently blowing from numerous petrochemical factories in the locality. So, kind of contemporary and historical aspects to the aim. Methodology, site visits, tours, local politically active groups of residents. In this case, you say you're taking tours to the current situations of historical ancestral burial sites and very active political disputes between local residents and powerful petrochemical companies who are trying to redevelop land, in particular to ignore the existence of ancestral burial sites. Site visits, photo documentation, forensic architecture as a methodology, yes, that would take some unpacking. I think one of the techniques, one of the methods that they use, again, just coming out of the chat, mapping of environmental changes. So they use visual imaging techniques to trace different pollutants. So you can't unpack it in detail, but each of the colours that you saw on the screen relates to a particular environmental pollutant. So they were able to take readings from the petrochemical plants all along this stretch of the Mississippi to work out when their periods of production were, and then they mapped that over the course of a year using environmental modelling software with the prevailing winds. So trying to detect the kind of the direction and the density of pollutants and how that was landing. Or how it's blowing over some settlements more than others. So, in a very short clip, I think this is great. You're now picking out lots of different kinds of individual methods that focus on one particular phenomena that's relevant either to the contemporary or the historical situation. And as you're moving into the objectives and the overall aims, you're working really clearly through your descriptions. Trying to understand how the local population are using these kind of knowledge to bring about very tangible change to their environments, both their current and their future environments, by fighting the development or the proposed development of a petrochemical plant, but also very explicitly trying to have ancient burial sites legally recognised in a way that would also prevent future developments. So I think the stuff that comes through the chat is great. Being able to look at like a very dense, short piece of film footage and begin to identify what are methods in that, what are the more specific aims of the project, specific objectives of the project, and the overarching aim. So fantastic. If you can do it for them, then you should be able to do it for your own dissertations and try and disentangle these different scales of thinking, but also understand how they're working together. So fantastic. I'll put the links to the forensic architecture stuff on Moodle. I think the exhibitions come down. I think the films on the Whitworth and the Manchester International Festival site are still there, but they might come down. But the forensic architecture site is a massive catalogue of all of their projects. So if you are interested in either looking at more of this project or looking at some of the other work they do, you can trace that back. Right, I want to say a little bit more about methods. So we talked a lot about using interviews because it's an extremely popular technique amongst dissertation students. A lot of students also use archives very beneficially. Sometimes this picks up on conversations or the presentation that Elaine Cook made last week about finding literature. Archives are often associated with or housed within libraries, but the way that you use archives is very different to the way that you might use a library. So I just want to try and sketch out some of the sorts of pros and cons or the practicalities of using archives. So this is kind of what some archives look like. These are archives I've either worked in or I'm working in. They vary hugely. So on the top you can see what looks like a library pretty much. These are institutional settings where stuff, collections are housed and usually catalogued. I've also worked in archives that are literally in someone's spare bedroom, and I've sat with practitioners or families of practitioners who were literally pulling stuff out of wardrobes and pulling stuff out from under the bed, extremely valuable documents that were just housed as part of ordinary stuff in an ordinary house. So don't necessarily think of archives as being well managed. Some of them are very accessible, well catalogued. Others will take a lot of searching. But archives can, like interviews, we were saying before the break, archives can be fantastic, helping you understand or tell more complex stories of other people, practices, buildings that we think we know about. So, as with mixed methodologies, you might use archives to help with your dissertation more generally. So it might be archival stuff in connection with other published documents. It might be that you use a number of different archives. Again, you find that collections are, for very different reasons, that they're spread around different institutions. So I did work on an architect called Gordon Matter Clark, some of which, the archives of which were in a spare bedroom, but also in institutional archives in Vienna and in North America. So you might need to move between different collections to get a fuller story. If that's of interest to you, why look at archives? Well, they sort of gather the backstory or the motivations behind practitioners, practices that help us understand a bit more about what they were thinking of in general, how their own practice developed. It might help us understand a bit more about a particular project if that's what we're looking at. They can be illegible. So I've worked on a number of different artists and architects, and some of them were barely legible. So unlike using libraries, archives like interviews, take a bit of creative interpretation, because you might literally be illegible, but they can give really insightful information. More organised archives. I've worked in the archives of Helen Chadwick. These are held at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds. So it's a much more organised environment. Helen Chadwick, as a person, had fantastic handwriting, so was literally reading through her notebooks was very clear, in contrast to some other archival stuff that you might encounter. Archives aren't just about documents, they include visual materials, they include objects. So again, if archives become part of your dissertation study, then keep an open mind as to what you might find in there. And it's really useful just to trace back the sort of development, or the genesis and development of projects, to help us kind of understand what they might have involved. And this is for the Helen Chadwick archive. They quite often include quite personal things. So when I was looking at her Filofax, it contained notes about projects, but it also contained sensitive information about her family, her contacts. It contained sensitive information about the price that she was getting for some of her artworks or some of her commissions, which I wasn't allowed to look at. So there might be some kind of access issues to bits of archival collections. If that's an issue, you might get full access to it, but how you use it might need a bit of careful consideration if it does reveal sort of personal details. Might also have books that they were using. So the Chadwick archive contains her entire library, and when she read stuff, she annotated it really heavily. So quite interesting, almost tracing her steps through books that she was reading to help understand how her thoughts were developing. Lots of notes in books, lots of notebooks about research that she was doing, but also about projects that she was developing. And so really rich kind of material to go through. Increasingly, you can get access to archival collections because they're being digitized. So when I was working on Chadwick's notebooks, I had to go to Leeds and spend time in the archive with the archivists, with the artifacts themselves. But increasingly, you'll find, especially institutional collections, are being made available online. So here, for example, Chadwick's notebooks, you can go through page by page, extremely high quality digitizations. So it just makes access really easy, but it's usually restricted to some of the most popular artifacts within an architect's or within an artist's archive. So going to visit the archive is still a useful activity if you can get there. Again, archives are very different to libraries. When Elaine was talking last week about literature researching, we expect everything in the library to be well catalogued and to be able to track things down quite quickly. Archives tend to go through slow processes of accessioning, so kind of cataloguing what the archive includes. So if you do find that there is an archive of a practice or of a person or of a project that you're working on, it's important that you make contact with the archivist. I was saying before the break, we can think of some of these people as kind of gatekeepers to a project. Archivists are there to help, or meant to be there to help, but they're very much the sort of gateway or the gatekeeper to these kinds of collections, mainly because it's very hard to describe exactly what an archive contains. So if you are interested in using an archive, it's important to get in touch with the archive as an institution, if it is institutionally held, and with the archivists in particular, and you just have a conversation with them about, well, I'm doing my dissertation about such and such. I know you've got the archive of so and so. Do you have anything that you think would help me? And it's like an interview almost. It's a sort of process of trying to explain what you're hoping to find out, and working through the archivist as a kind of human catalogue of what they think is in there. And it'll take a bit of creative interpretation. So if you think this is something that will be useful for you, then make contact with the archivist early and try and start those conversations. Yeah, so it's, you know, unlike using a library, which you can sort of do from a distance, working with archives usually does involve, you know, the archivist as an intermediary, either to point you in the right direction, to tell you if they've got stuff that they think is relevant for your dissertation, or in some cases literally to fetch stuff. So some archives you're allowed in and you can just sort of go through the collections that they hold. Others, like the Henry Moore Institute, for example, all the archival material is held in a vault. So the only way that you can get stuff to your desk is with the archivist literally going into the vaults and bringing it out. So you need to build up a good rapport with them if it's to be a useful process. Yeah, fantastic. And again, gives you access to, like interviews, gives you access to, you know, previously unseen material and really fantastic resources. If this might fit your dissertation, just some tips. Yeah, they're not libraries, but often they're in libraries. Unlike libraries, which have fairly uniform approaches to catalogues and catalogue searching, archives all tend to be different. You know, each institution sets up its own kind of archival record system. Archivists are people, not just a catalogue, so do develop a rapport with them. Some archives are hidden, like in people's bedrooms, in family bedrooms. So you might require some detective work to track them down. Some things are hidden in archives. Even archivists won't know exactly what's there. So it does take a bit of patience and detective work. Archives tend to move. You know, so I worked on the archive of Gordon Matter Clark when it was in the family spare bedroom. It's now held at the Centre for Contemporary Architecture in Montreal. So yeah, they do sort of move around. There's no right way to use an archive. It'd be the same way that there's no right way to do an interview. Just think about how it fits with your dissertation and open up from there. Right, any questions about archives? If you have, pop it in the chat and I'll come back to it. I want to press on. Last section about methodologies very quickly, then a little bit about ethics very quickly, then you can disappear and get on with your day. I've talked in detail about ethnographic methodologies and talked in detail about two very popular methods that dissertation students use. I just want to finish talking about methodologies, and again looking at just a number of methodological approaches that are popular with student dissertations. I kind of tie myself in a knot here, but these are sort of methodologies about methodologies or approach to dissertation that pursue what we call revisionist methodologies. So I'll just try and explain what these are and give just a very quick sample of recent and current revisionist methodological approaches in ways that, you know, hopefully will resonate with some of you. So I can't remember, well, obviously I'm just sort of speaking into the void here. I can't see who's in the audience. For those of you who've come through your undergraduate studies at MSA, I might have seen you before, probably in second year, where I gave a lecture about what is architectural history. This is a sort of hinge in that lecture, and I just want to re-show it here. The point of the lecture and the point of revisionist methodologies is to just sort of stare architectural history, landscape history, urban history in the face, and recognise that most of it has been written by privileged white men, and that's kind of set the tone for a great deal of architectural history, theory and practice. landscape architectural history, theory and practice, urban history, theory and practice for many thousands of years. Revisionist histories set out explicitly to challenge the kind of inherited methodological approach that these sorts of famous writers embody and enact. So their approaches are dissertations that look at how architectural stories have been told previously and take issue with those. So they're dissertations or they're projects that have more explicit political aim, interested in sort of power dynamics and power relations, interested in the sort of more complex identity politics that are involved in architecture, landscape and urbanism, how that might influence practice, and how it might influence the uses of the places that we produce. So I just want to go very quickly on it. I appreciate that this is a danger of becoming tokenistic, but I think it's important to just sort of step back and emphasize the importance of methodologies that contest other methodologies. This is an approach that many students find really productive. So historically, I just want to look at revisionist methodologies that are revolving around class, then feminism, postcolonialism, and then most recently on the back of Black Lives Matter. So in a sort of chronological story, emerging out of 1960s, and particularly student protests in 1968, there are a number of class-based revisionist methodologies where groups, usually rather than individuals, would set themselves up to try and rewrite architectural history in a way that would inform and radically reshape architectural, here mainly architectural practice. So these are just some examples. On the left, the Architects Revolutionary Council, an explicitly Marxist collective who tried to, or who challenged the way that the RBA was set up and challenged the way in which architectural history was written and practice was carried out. Still, as you can see, it's a bunch of white men, in this case, with a very different class base and politics. Alongside, or kind of emerging as a splinter group from the ARC, movements like the New Architecture movement also emerge. So, we can tell stories, or there are plenty of examples of research and practice approaches that have taken an explicitly revisionist methodological approach, trying to reframe the way in which architecture is understood and practiced. Kind of emerging from class-based politics and revisionist methodologies. So previous slide in sort of 70s, moving into the 80s, practices like matrix, explicitly feminist architectural practice set up, ran until 1994, I think. So examples of practices that are operating explicitly in a feminist, with a feminist methodology. So matrix historically, and then below matrix, MUF, still going, architectural collective that situates itself explicitly in a sort of lineage of feminist practice. And on the left-hand side of the slide, these are more research-based projects that work in tandem with feminist practices. And so writing about architecture, urbanism, landscape in ways that contest the sort of canon that have been produced by white men. Incidentally, if you're interested, Matrix are the subject of an exhibition that's still on at the Barbican Centre in London, closes just before Christmas this year. So either in studio, or if your dissertation might be moving in this direction, if you could try and pick up the Matrix exhibition, which will be not only interesting but relevant and useful. Again, just trying to follow these revisionist methodologies through in a sort of chronological arc. postcolonialism, and again, another really significant revisionist methodology that many students find really useful as a framework for dissertations. Again, not giving a lecture on postcolonialism, but looking particularly at the work or the writings of Edward Said, very influential kind of cultural studies text that he wrote called Orientalism in the late 80s. And then people like Homi Bhabha working through the 80s into the 90s to develop complex theories of post-colonialism that I won't unpack at the moment. But then in the 2000s, or during the 90s and 2000s, the work from cultural studies being folded explicitly into an architectural, urbanism and landscape environment. People like my good friend Felipe Hernandez, who wrote one of these Routledge guides on Homi Bhabha, or Homi Bhabha's thinking for architects. And then on the right hand side of the slide, some of the texts that Felipe has written really about Latin American architecture, informal architecture, so informed by post-colonial thinking and the way it allows different kinds of architectural practice to be understood and valued and taken seriously, but also how that can be taken forward as a political project and as a project that would inform practice as well as more historical writing. And then last example, fascinating, fantastic collaborative partnership. Matho and Dakuna, who work mainly out of Princeton, and they've got a practice based in North America, but whose approach to practice and whose research work is again explicitly framed in a post-colonial methodology. It's a starting point for one of my dissertation groups last year. I think it's really interesting as an example because between the two of them, they are qualified landscape architect and urban planner. So they sort of operate across a variety of different scales. But for all of you, I think there'll be things in there that would be interesting. I won't talk about them in more detail, but I think that if you visit the website, again, like forensic architecture, it's a really rich catalogue of the projects that they've done, either as practitioners, researchers, but also they're both prolific teachers. So a lot of the projects they've done with their students and really well, well documented. And then just to finish, perhaps most current, most present in our minds. Motivated by the Black Lives Matter movement, seen a great focus recently on critical race theory and on thinking about revisionist methodologies that take race as their starting point. So again, just two examples. The first one is a collective endeavour produced by Aaron Cheng, Charles David and Mabel Wilson, and it's an overview, or it's a kind of survey critique of the Western canon and an offering of a sort of revisionist reading of architectural history. It's again, arguably, it's still very Western in its focus for reasons that are appropriate to their project. And then one of the authors from that overview, Mabel Wilson, she published a book I became aware of in 2012. Obviously, I'm interested in fairs and festivals and expos. So she produced a book of her own research on Black public history and its involvement in fairs and expos in the United States of America. So a very specific kind of geographical location, but in this case, a revisionist history, a revisionist architectural history that reached back into the middle of the 19th century and traced through a number of fairly familiar architectural examples, a different story through that, one that focused on Black involvement in well-known architectural and urban projects, and also within that sort of strands of more politicized movements that explicitly set up Black public histories through the commissioning of the alternate expos and alternative museum buildings. So again, I think all of these revisionist histories provide really useful starting points for dissertations, and something that we see a lot of every year. So it kind of takes the methodological approach and as its starting point, something that someone asked early on in today's presentation. At what point do you start thinking about methods and methodologies? Well, hopefully these 4 last examples would give you a way into your dissertations that starts with a very specific methodological approach that would allow you to frame your aim, work through to develop and refine your objectives, and then to choose methods that were appropriate to your particular project. I'll skip that. So just to sum up all of this stuff on methodology, I'm again conscious that we cover in these lectures an enormous amount of material, and it's hard for you individually to listen to us, Leandro and to me, talking in quite generic ways about your specific projects that haven't really begun yet. And so just hold on to this, revisit the slides when your projects become clearer. And when you're thinking about your methodologies, it used to be useful to go through this as a sort of checklist and think about how you've chosen and deployed methods in your dissertation. If you're using more than one method, why have you chosen them and how have you combined them? How does that feed into your bigger objectives, your bigger aim for the whole piece of work? How do you justify your selections? Again, not everyone needs to use an interview. Not, as David was saying, not everyone needs a highly structured interview. One question might be sufficient. So think about choosing your methods carefully. You can try things out. If they don't work, drop them. But when you settle down, how do you justify using them? Again, in the context of the whole research design. How do your methodologies and your methods link to some of the more philosophical framings that you might have identified through the literature review? If you've had to adapt certain methods or methodologies for your study, it's useful to draw attention to those. And again, you get credit for doing that. And so on. I'll leave it at that point. Right, I'm conscious that I should say something very quickly about methods about ethics before we go. So I've been talking a lot about working with people, either with interviews or observations, even in archives. So for all of you, probably to some extent, you'll develop a dissertation project that involves people in some way or involves stakeholders in some way. Not necessarily all of you, but there'll be decisions that you make that have ethical implications, ethical questions and value judgments that you have to resolve, either in conversation with your tutor or in conversation with people that might be putting themselves forward and agreeing to become a participant in your research. When you're designing your overall dissertation, think of it ethically as well, and that could be at the level of its aims, and it could be how you're hoping to involve people as participants in the research that you do. Don't think of ethics as being an obstacle to asking awkward questions. Don't think of ethics as being a bureaucratic hurdle that you've got to jump over before you get on with something that's more interesting. I would argue that thinking through your project, your dissertation design, in terms of its ethics, helps you to think about these big connections between your overall questions, your context, your methods, your methodology, how you bring all of those together and frame them and justify them in an ethical way. Now, if there's a change afoot, so historically, until last year, if you were using human participants as part of your dissertation, whether that be interviews or observations, you'd need to get formal ethical approval. So before you carried out any interviews or observations, the university would need to check what your plans were and satisfy itself that what you were proposing was ethical. When you got clearance, then you could go ahead and do the observations or interviews or whatever it was. I think this year that all of you will have to go through the ethics approval process, even if it's just to declare that you have no ethical approval required. I mean, it sounds bonkers, we're checking it out, but it looks like all of you will have to go through the ethics process that I will explain in a minute. So the principles of ethics, or I think the principles of researching ethically, are around respect, for all of your stakeholders, kind of rigor of what you're doing as researchers, and also taking responsibility for looking after the kind of data that you get from different sources. In terms of how that plays out in the process, as I said a minute ago, it's important that you think about ethics in the way that you design the project and choose its methods. It's important in the way that you carry out your research. It's also important in the way that you write it up and submit dissertation, making sure that you give due credit to everyone that's been involved in helping you. So the kind of principles that you should be living by. I'm sure you are in your day-to-day lives, but also in your dissertation lives. Principles are that we're not special just because we're in a university. You, as a researcher, don't have any special exemption from the rest of society. So researchers have no privileged position in the way that they should gain information. Well, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to, in an ethically inappropriate way, I'm going to skip over the interactive bit and look at the ethical principles that should govern the work that you do as researchers on your dissertation. Nothing surprising, I would hope. The expectation is the interests of participants, interviewees, or people that are taking part in focus groups or doing surveys for you, they should be protected. Usually, researchers should avoid deception and misrepresentation. So you shouldn't be getting information from people and by lying to them about what you're trying to do. And then the core principle really to guide what you do is that participants should give you what's called informed consent. So we were talking about it earlier in broad terms. If you're trying to set up an interview, for example, you need to explain who you are and what you're doing and why you want to talk to them. And they need to be able to agree to that, usually formally, with enough information to understand what they're letting themselves in for, why you want to talk to them, what kind of data you're expecting from them. So informed consent is really key to sort of ethical behaviour. And there's also aspects of the ethical approval process that's about you and it's about your safety, your personal safety in terms of where you might go, the sites that you might visit to gather information for your dissertations, whether that's taking you kind of off the beaten track, taking you to places that are not necessarily public, or you're going places out of daylight hours, you're visiting places at night or at the weekend because of the nature of your question. So we're not discouraging you from asking those questions, but if your dissertation does involve you visiting those kinds of sites or working at those kinds of times, there are processes that we can put in place that respond to your personal safety. So you think through how you get to and from those places safely. Similarly, safety of researchers. Sometimes the way that you ask questions can, working with participants can expose you to upsetting information. It's extremely unlikely for architectural, landscape or urban dissertations, but it is possible. So although most ethics discussions focus on other people, part of this consideration is about you and your health and safety. Then research etiquette. Sometimes there are debates about whether you should pay people or reward people. We're all asked to do online surveys with the offer of, I don't know, an Amazon voucher. Unlikely for a dissertation survey or interview you'd be able to offer any kind of payment or reward. If you're running a focus group, you might think about getting some basic refreshments in just to sort of look after people. But again, if you have any questions about how you're setting up those kinds of activities, talk in more detail with your tutor. Again, it's just good practice to inform people of the outcome. What happens after you've taken their interview or their survey and processed it. Remember the story of the dissertation that was done on Rudy's Pizzeria. Good practice to share your dissertation with people that have helped you. Might even get a free pizza if you do that, as well as their thanks. Something that I'm very conscious that I'm doing right now, which is research overload, coming up to 3 hours of me talking at you pretty much, which is inhumane, I realise. So absolutely not leading by example. If you're talking to people, try and avoid research overload, try and avoid designing overlong interviews, overlong questionnaires, asking them things that aren't important for your topic. So I apologise for doing it to you. Please don't do that to other people. Again, a key principle, once you've explained to participants who you are, why you want to talk to them or survey them, you can't pressure them to take part. Equally, they might start an interview and it's accepted that they can withdraw. They can just stop at any time without having to offer you an explanation. So participation in your research is entirely voluntary. You can't coerce people to get involved in the first place or to stay involved once they start. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more detail in a second about this. You should give information to people in a format they can understand about the purposes of your research, about who you are, about what role they will play in that research, and about what you're going to do with their findings. You should also usually explain how you handle their data. I mentioned in the interviews, it's common practice to record interviews, either audio recordings, possibly video recordings. You need to have the agreement of your participants for that to happen. Also, it's important to explain to your participants how you will look after that data. So if you have an audio file, again, good practice to keep that in as a password protected file, or to keep it in a safe place, or both. So looking after their data is also important. Right, lastly, really, it's your responsibility to apply for ethics approval. In the old days, we could do this on your behalf. Certainly for most dissertations, we'd have a sort of blanket ethical approval. So unless you were doing something quite unusual, all of your activities would be covered. The world has changed. So now it's your responsibility to apply for ethics approval. This probably doesn't make a great deal of sense at this point in the dissertation process. So we'll have a kind of catch-up session around Christmas, as you're starting to develop more detailed plans about how you'll gather information. And we'll walk you through the ethics approval process in a bit more detail. The ethics approval is run by MMU. There's a system called Ethos, which you can see, but I can't because I belong to the University of Manchester. So you can follow this link and it'll give you some guidance about planning your projects with ethics in mind. It will give you some information about how to go through the ethics portal and what kind of information you need. So it's one system both for undergraduate and for PGT projects, dissertations particularly. So you can follow that through at Ethos. And I think for all of you, it looks like you'll need to open an Ethos account for your dissertation, or a project registry for your dissertation, even if your declaration is that I don't need any ethical clearance. It looks like you have to log your dissertation onto the system. If you're using human beings in some way, then you'd need to follow through with more information and declare that, yeah, my dissertation will involve interviews, or I'm doing a survey, I'm doing some focus groups or participant observation, whatever it is. It's not particularly onerous, but there are a series of steps that again are useful because they prompt you to prepare your questionnaire or your kind of guide, to think about how you approach how you recruit your participants. So there's a description of your dissertation through the lens of its potential ethical implications. Who's doing the research? What are you doing? How are you doing it? What are your methods? And what are the benefits of doing it? What will you ask participants to do? How will you handle their data? How will you explain your project to them through information sheets? And so I'm afraid all of you will have to do a version of this. If you're not using people, it will be more straightforward. If you are using interviews or human subjects somehow, there'll be a version of this that will be relevant for you, but we'll put more detailed presentation together. Siobhan Barry is the MSA ethics lead. So Siobhan and I will probably come back and talk in a bit more detail about the mechanics of the Ethos system as an early or a late Christmas present. You can tell you can barely wait. Right, unethically, that was far too long. But if you are still there and you would like to ask any questions, ask away. If you just want to go get some fresh air and prepare for research methods, then that's fine. You can email me with any questions. My email's on the slides, which I will shortly post to Moodle. And once Zoom has processed the recording, I'll put the recording on Moodle, and I'll put the links in for the forensic architecture stuff as well. I'm done. I'm sure you're exhausted if you're still there. If no one's got any questions, for the MArch students only, will be a session next Tuesday, same time. It will be with Leandro, probably with me as well, going through the sort of hustings, so choosing dissertation groups and the process through which you'll vote for your dissertation tutor group. So that's next Tuesday, so 26th at 10 o'clock. We'll put details on Moodle beforehand. Okay, I'm sure you're whacked, so I will wave you goodbye and probably see you next week. Any questions, let me know. If any questions emerge when you are working on your dissertations, then yeah, by all means, contact me in 3 weeks or 6 weeks or 9 weeks, whenever. Thank you very much.